Ladies and gentlemen, power does not crave the spotlight. The loudest nations often reveal the hollowness of their strategy. The real masters of power move in silence, watching, calculating, waiting, not for opportunity, but for inevitability. India did not scream, it did not threaten, it did not posture, it studied. For decades it absorbed humiliation, tolerated border games, faced propaganda, and said nothing, because power that speaks too soon is power wasted. Then, in a moment of exquisite timing, it whispered with fire. The BrahMos missile was not a declaration of war, it was a lesson in restraint, precision, authority. It was the perfect demonstration of Law 3, conceal your intentions, and Law 15, crush your enemy totally. China, for all its showmanship, had not expected this. The one who boasts rarely prepares for pain. While one side crafted narratives, the other crafted a weapon that speaks without permission. Understand this, strategy is not about how many moves you make. It's about making one move so precise, so clean, that all other options vanish. That is what India did. The strike was not just physical, it was psychological. It did not aim to destroy infrastructure. It destroyed confidence. Doubt spread faster than any blast wave. Who will act? Who will retaliate? What else does India possess that it hasn't shown? This is the true art of war, not in attack, but in aura. Not in destruction, but in disruption. In a single move, India shifted the perception of its global position from a regional force to a disciplined power with global intent. You don't rise by demanding recognition. You rise by mastering the timing of your silence and the precision of your action. The world is now silent, not because it agrees, but because it was unprepared. This is how you command power, not by shouting, but by showing what happens when you've had enough. Let that be your lesson. Let others play for applause. You play for checkmate. India just did. Would you like this in voice-over script format or turned into a YouTube video structure with timestamps, keywords, and SEO-friendly description? Power is not in motion. It is in restraint, in choosing the perfect moment to strike when silence has built anticipation into fear. Power in its purest form does not need to move constantly, nor does it require spectacle. True power is still, it waits, it calculates, because the one who acts too soon acts from emotion, not strategy. Motion for the sake of motion is noise, but silence, controlled silence, is terrifying. It creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, others begin to imagine, speculate, fear. Restraint is not weakness, it is control. It is the rarest and most valuable asset in any power game. The impatient reveal their strategy, the anxious expose their intentions, but the restrained, they are unreadable, unpredictable, and in that unpredictability lies the seed of dominance. When you remain silent, intentionally, strategically, you force the world to react to your stillness. They wonder, why isn't he moving? What is she planning? That uncertainty spreads like a virus. In the absence of noise, imagination grows, and the imagination is always crueler than reality. People begin to see threats where there are none, patterns in your calm that don't exist. They tighten their defenses, they overextend, and in doing so, they weaken themselves. This is why silence and restraint are more powerful than reaction. You are not just avoiding mistakes, you are weaponizing patience. You are letting time become your accomplice while your opponent grows tired, careless, or cocky, and then, only then, you strike, not in desperation, not in anger, but in perfect timing. Your strike is swift, sharp, and surgical. It carries the weight of all that silence before it, because by then, the world is already primed to be shocked. You haven't just attacked a position, you've pierced their illusion of control. You've confirmed the one thing they feared, that you were always in command. This is why anticipation is such a powerful psychological tool. The longer you delay, the more attention you gather, but it must be purposeful. You are not stalling, you are building tension like a drawn bowstring. The silence must have purpose behind it. When that purpose is finally revealed, it doesn't just defeat, it devastates. Think of history's greatest strategic minds. They were never frantic. They didn't announce every move. They created myths around their stillness. Their restraint became legendary because power that is always seen becomes common, but power that hides until it must be revealed becomes mythic. So do not move unless it is necessary. Do not speak unless it is strategic. Let your stillness speak louder than your noise ever could. For when the moment comes, your single act will carry the weight of all that silence. And silence, when finally broken with precision, becomes the loudest sound in the world. India did not roar, it whispered with a missile, and the world held its breath. Because true dominance doesn't ask for attention, it demands respect. Power does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the precision of a single act that speaks more than 1,000 declarations ever could. India did not need to shout, posture, or perform. It did not need global approval, media campaigns, or performative alliances. It only needed one well-calculated move, one silent statement, to shift the entire axis of perception. A roar is loud but brief. It satisfies ego but does little to change reality. Whispers, on the other hand, linger. They travel further not because of their volume but because of their mystery. India's missile strike, executed with surgical precision, wasn't about destruction. It was about message. It was a whisper into the global psyche that said, "We are not here to be seen, we are here to be remembered." The world is used to powers that scream for attention, superpowers that hold press conferences before making a move, that leak intentions before taking action, that thrive on spectacle and dominance narratives. India chose the opposite path. No drama, no preamble, no overreaction. Just one precise strike that sent waves across borders, across headlines, and across the strategic consciousness of every observer. In that moment, the world did something rare. It paused, it held its breath, it didn't know what would come next, and in that pause, the reality of India's capabilities settled in. Not because of what was said, but because of what was done, and what could be done again. That is the essence of true dominance. It doesn't beg for validation. It doesn't perform for applause. It simply acts and lets the consequence speak in silence. This is the difference between attention and respect. Attention is cheap, it's everywhere, it's addictive and fleeting. Respect, however, is earned in moments like this, where power is shown, not flaunted, where decisions are made not from impulse, but from deep, strategic stillness. Where force is used not to provoke, but to clarify one's boundaries. The world saw a side of India it wasn't prepared for, a side that wasn't seeking permission, a side that didn't care for optics, a side that understood power not as an expression, but as an outcome. And that outcome wasn't chaos, it was clarity, a whisper from a missile, a pause across the world, a shift in perception that no speech, summit, or slogan could ever achieve. That's not just military strength. That's psychological power. India didn't need to demand attention. It created a moment where even its silence became a presence too loud to ignore. That is how respect is forged. In the spaces where fear meets admiration and noise bows before strategy. The BrahMos was not just a weapon. It was a message written in steel: we will not be provoked, but we will not be denied. In the realm of modern power, symbols carry more weight than speeches, and actions engrave themselves deeper than threats. The BrahMos missile was not fired in haste, nor in fury. It was launched with intent, calculated, cold, deliberate. It was not just a show of military capability, it was a declaration of principle. A statement to every nation watching that India's patience is not passivity, and its silence is not surrender. The BrahMos carried more than payload and precision. It carried posture. It was a steel-etched response to years of testing boundaries, encroachments, and strategic gamesmanship from adversaries who mistook India's composure for weakness. It was a reminder that restraint is not a lack of power, but the discipline of it. And when that discipline chooses to act, it does so with devastating clarity. India had every opportunity to roar in the past, to respond to provocations with equal noise, but it didn't, it observed. It calculated, it adapted, because strategic maturity lies in knowing not just how to act, but when and why. The BrahMos strike was not about escalation, it was about establishment, establishing a new threshold, establishing that while India may not provoke conflict, it will never allow its sovereignty, its dignity, or its strategic red lines to be dismissed. That missile did not travel alone. It was accompanied by history, by context, by years of diplomacy, standoffs, and blurred boundaries, and in its flight, it carried a message forged from all those unspoken tensions. Enough. That message landed not just on a target, but in the minds of those who assumed India would remain perpetually reactive, never proactive. The missile was not vengeance, it was validation of a doctrine that prizes peace, but will not hesitate to protect it with force, of a mindset that sees power not in domination, but in deterrence, and of a nation that does not demand to be feared, only understood and respected. The phrase, "we will not be provoked," reveals a deeper truth. India does not bend to the emotional traps set by its adversaries. It does not allow its strategy to be dictated by media cycles or political theater. And yet, "we will not be denied" echoes with unwavering firmness. It asserts that India's place at the table, its territorial integrity, its vision for regional balance, these are not open to negotiation through intimidation. So the BrahMos was more than a missile. It was steel-cut diplomacy. It was power in physical form. It was the embodiment of a line drawn with precision. Cross it, and India will respond, not with noise, but with certainty. That is how modern power speaks, not in threats, but in actions that echo across silence. China plays the game of perception. India played the game of reality. Perception can only deceive the weak. In the theater of global power, perception is often mistaken for dominance. The ability to control headlines, craft narratives, and choreograph international opinion has become a weapon in itself. China has mastered this craft, projecting strength, influence, and inevitability through a carefully maintained image. Military parades, economic partnerships, cyber influence operations, territorial claims, all are designed to create the illusion of unchallengeable authority. But perception, while powerful, is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. It is a house of mirrors, impressive at a distance, but hollow when examined up close. India, by contrast, did not invest its strategy in theatrics. It did not flood the media with projections of dominance or warnings of retaliation. Instead, it focused on reality, the unspoken power of preparation, patience, and precise action. While others crafted narratives, India built capability. While China extended its influence through debt traps and media manipulation, India expanded through infrastructure, defense modernization, and strategic partnerships rooted in mutual respect rather than coercion. Perception can only deceive those who lack clarity. It dazzles the weak because they confuse image with substance, but those grounded in history and strategy know better. They know that the loudest are often compensating and the quietest are often planning. India never sought to match China in theatrics. It sought to surpass it in effectiveness. The BrahMos strike, or any act of deliberate strength, did not come with bluster. It wasn't announced with fanfare. It wasn't positioned for the cameras. It simply happened, and the shock it generated was proof of how deeply reality can cut through illusion. China had played the psychological game, pushing boundaries, testing patience, assuming that India, bound by image-conscious restraint, would always respond within predictable parameters. But when perception meets preparedness, illusion collapses. India's response was not flamboyant, it was final, not reactionary but refined, and in that moment the global audience realized something vital. Real power doesn't posture, it acts. China's dominance has always relied on being perceived as inevitable. Its image is reinforced by intimidation, fast-paced growth, and controlled messaging. But perception unchallenged becomes arrogance, and arrogance becomes a weakness when confronted by grounded strength. India exposed this. It reminded the world that substance, even when silent, is always more dangerous than spectacle. Perception can never sustain itself indefinitely. At some point, it must be tested by reality. And when that moment comes, only those who built real strength beneath the surface will stand. India played that game wisely. It didn't try to outshine the illusion. It waited for the right moment to dissolve it with truth. In a world addicted to optics, India's refusal to perform gave it an unexpected advantage, the power to shock, and that shock, rooted in reality, left a deeper mark than 1,000 well-staged performances ever could. Every empire that rose without humility eventually fell to one that studied in silence and moved with discipline. India is that silent student turned strategist. History is full of great empires, vast, wealthy, aggressive in expansion, arrogant in power. They believed themselves unchallengeable, eternal, above consequence. Yet, one by one, they collapsed, not always by sheer force, but often by the steady rise of a quieter, more focused challenger. The common flaw of dominant powers is pride. When they rise too fast, they forget to look behind them. They assume silence equals submission, and they mistake patience for fear. But true strength grows in the shadows. It does not need applause. It requires no approval. It studies, it watches, it takes notes as others overextend themselves. And when the time comes, it acts with such discipline and precision that the empire it confronts has no time to respond. India, for decades, wore the mask of the silent student, observing global games, bearing injustices, absorbing conflicts without exploding. It endured attempts to isolate it, undermine it, provoke it. But instead of reacting emotionally, it internalized the lessons. It chose evolution over explosion. While the world debated its role, India refined its identity. While others shouted about power, India built it. Quietly, methodically, purposefully. The world noticed India's rise, but often misunderstood it. They saw it as slow, uncertain, too democratic to be decisive. What they failed to recognize was that India wasn't sprinting, it was preparing. It wasn't eager for attention, it was training for endurance, and in that discipline lay its greatest weapon. Empires that rise too fast often neglect character. They accumulate wealth but lose wisdom. They collect allies through fear, not respect, and in doing so, they create the illusion of invincibility until they meet an adversary who studied every move in silence and countered with strategy instead of spectacle. India is no longer just the student. It has become the strategist. It understands when to speak and when to remain still. It knows that aggression without calculation is weakness. And above all, it knows that humility is not submission. It is awareness of one's strength and the wisdom to reserve it for the right moment. The global balance of power is shifting, not because of those who shout the loudest, but because of those who have been quietly preparing for decades. India represents the new model of power, democratic but decisive, humble but unshakable, silent when needed and thunderous only when required. The old empires may have had their time, built on force and fear, but the future belongs to those who endured the storms in silence, learned from every wound and emerged not bitter, but sharper, wiser, and ruthlessly focused. India's silence was not weakness, it was calculation. And now the student has become the strategist. The world will have to recalibrate because what they mistook for delay was design all along. In warfare, victory is not in the noise of retaliation, but in the art of psychological paralysis. One BrahMos strike did what decades of diplomacy could not. Modern warfare has evolved beyond tanks and trenches. Today, the most decisive battles are not always fought with armies, but with perception, timing, and the ability to freeze the enemy without even speaking. The BrahMos missile strike was not merely an act of military precision, it was psychological warfare at its finest. No nation was physically destroyed, but many were mentally disarmed. That is the essence of true power, not in destruction, but in the creation of doubt, hesitation, and recalibration. For years, diplomacy tried to maintain balance. Agreements were signed, handshakes exchanged, and red lines discussed behind closed doors. Yet, provocations persisted, borders were tested, sovereignty was poked with calibrated aggression, and still, India remained committed to the path of dialogue. But diplomacy, while noble, has its limits, especially when the other side mistakes patience for passivity. Then came the BrahMos. It wasn't a barrage, it wasn't a war cry, it was one single, deliberate move, a scalpel, not a sword. But its impact reverberated far beyond the physical target. It was a demonstration of restraint meeting resolve. And in that strike, decades of ignored warnings, fruitless negotiations, and manipulated peace were reduced to a single undeniable fact. India will act when it must, and when it does, it will do so with devastating clarity. This is where the art of psychological paralysis comes into play. The missile did more than hit a target, it shattered assumptions, it exposed vulnerabilities, disrupted narratives, and made every nation in the region pause. Not because they feared a war, but because they realized something far more unsettling. India had crossed the threshold from reactive to proactive power. When a country once known for diplomatic forbearance suddenly responds with precision force, the message is not just to the target, it is to the world, it is a shift in posture, it is a redefinition of boundaries. And it instantly alters how every future move will be interpreted. Psychological warfare is not about constant aggression. It is about creating uncertainty in the opponent's mind. It is about making them ask, what else are they willing to do? It is about removing predictability. And unpredictability, when backed by capability, is one of the most effective deterrents. The BrahMos strike, therefore, was not just a military decision. It was a psychological masterstroke. It communicated what words failed to convey, that India's red lines are real, its patience has limits, and its silence is not to be mistaken for submission. Diplomacy seeks peace through talk. Deterrence ensures peace through power. The BrahMos brought both to the table, but with one difference: it didn't ask for peace. It demanded respect, and in doing so, it achieved what decades of polite diplomacy never could: an immediate and unforgettable recalibration of how India is perceived in the strategic hierarchy of the world. Let the world debate, panic, politicize. The wise do not explain power. They demonstrate it in one perfect, undeniable act. True power does not concern itself with noise. It does not seek validation through dialogue or demand attention through spectacle. It does not plead for recognition or perform for applause. Power, real, strategic, timeless power, moves in silence and strikes with precision. It leaves no space for confusion, no room for argument. One act, perfectly executed, becomes the entire conversation. While others argue over intent, justification, and consequences, the wise are already 5 moves ahead, unseen, unshaken, and fully in control. In the age of hyperinformation, the world is addicted to narratives. Every event is filtered through bias, every move interpreted through the lens of ideology, media, and political agenda. But power doesn't need a narrative, it writes its own in steel, fire, and precision. When India launched the BrahMos missile in a calculated, controlled strike, it did not hold a press conference to explain itself. It did not ask for permission. It didn't need to. The missile itself was the message. And that is the difference between the powerful and the desperate. The desperate need to be heard, the powerful need only to act. The world may speculate, project, condemn, or glorify, But in the end, one undeniable truth remains: something changed, and it changed because of that single act. The wise understand that power is not in provocation, but in control. It is not in the storm, but in the calm before and after. It is in the ability to wait, to absorb, and to choose exactly when to strike, so that the strike itself ends the conversation. No rebuttal, no counterpoint, just stunned silence. India's demonstration of strength was not just military, it was philosophical. It was a reflection of ancient wisdom wielded in a modern context. The world has often underestimated India's resolve, mistaking its democratic patience for indecision, its strategic silence for inaction. But those who watch closely understand that India doesn't react, it calculates. It doesn't threaten, it prepares, and when it moves, it does not overreach. It delivers just enough to shift the balance without tipping the scale into chaos. That is the art of the wise, not to destroy, but to redefine. Not to provoke, but to paralyze. One move, perfectly placed, that forces every player on the board to pause, reassess, and recalibrate. Let the politicians argue. Let the analysts fill the airwaves. Let the world twist itself into explanations and justifications. That is their game. The wise play a different one that does not need to shout to be understood, one that does not need to prove anything, because the act itself says it all. In a world obsessed with noise, true power is revealed through silence, followed by a single perfect strike. And in that moment, no explanation is necessary, because when power is real, it speaks for itself, and the world listens whether it wants to or not. Power in its purest form is not always displayed through presence. It is often defined by restraint. Robert Greene's laws of power emphasize timing, perception, and the art of appearing weaker or stronger when it suits your long game. But there are moments in history when a nation does not just follow power, it redefines it. India, in its strategic silence and precise execution, revealed a deeper law that even the classic texts have yet to fully capture. When faced with relentless propaganda, the most powerful response is not a louder voice, it's a quiet act of undeniable strength. China, and other adversaries like it, often rely on an unending echo of narratives, control the media, flood the world with noise, reshape perception through repetition. This is not new. Empires have always used propaganda to sway minds and project dominance, especially when their actual strength is either in question or under pressure. But what happens when that propaganda meets a wall of disciplined silence? When every provocation is met not with counter-narratives, but with strategic calm? India's recent response was not rhetorical. It didn't play the media game, it didn't counter with grand speeches or reactive outrage. It responded with a single move, a BrahMos strike, not in fury but in finality. That one move silenced entire campaigns of noise, drowned out months of political maneuvering, and rendered debates obsolete. In that moment, silence spoke louder than every headline ever printed. This is a new kind of power, a more dangerous one, because it's not performative. It doesn't need to convince. It only needs to act. Propaganda, at its core, seeks to provoke. It's designed to elicit response, to pull the opponent into a war of words, of optics, of narratives. But when the opponent refuses to play along, when the opponent remains patient, watches, and chooses to act only once with precision, the illusion collapses. India didn't just master the timing, it mastered the terrain of psychological warfare. It chose not to explain its red lines but to demonstrate them, and in doing so, it flipped the script. No longer is silence seen as weakness. In India's case, silence became the sharpest blade, waiting in the dark, unseen, and then cutting with one clean strike that forced the world to listen. This is what power looks like in the new age. It doesn't always roar, it whispers, and the echo of that whisper travels farther than any shouted threat. Timing is still essential, as Greene teaches. But now there's a 49th law, unspoken yet observed. In a world obsessed with noise, let your silence be a weapon. Let it grow, build tension, draw out the enemy, and then let a single act destroy months of misinformation. India has mastered this balance, and through one decisive moment, it rewrote how modern states will wield influence by turning silence into the most feared message of all.